Picture this, it's night, a deserted road, and a police patrol stops a car with a black man inside. The cop gets out of the car, his face expressing contempt and suspicion. "So, buddy, decided to rob someone and run?" he says with a grin. The man behind the wheel is silent, and his eyes are calm and confident. The cop doesn't even suspect that this man is the new sheriff in town. But what happens next? What will be the outcome of this tense encounter? Sit back, because this story will leave you wondering and wondering. In the meantime, write in the comments where you are watching this video from. Let's find out how many people we have from all over the world. The policeman, out of habit, looked the driver over from head to toe, not noticing anything other than the color of his skin. A stereotypical idea instantly flashed in his mind. If a black man is driving, something is wrong. Without asking any questions, without trying to understand the situation, he immediately set himself up for aggression. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The policeman's voice was sharp, almost threatening. The man behind the wheel remained calm, his hands on the wheel, watching his every move, knowing that any wrong step could be dangerous for him. "No, I don't know," he replied, looking at the policeman with a cold but restrained smile. The cop stepped closer, looking at the man in front of him as if he were already a criminal. "We got a tip about an armed robbery a few blocks from here. And guess what? The suspect is black. Like you. Fits the description. You don't know the shit you're in, buddy." The man remained silent, his gaze betraying no emotion. At this point, the policeman began to seethe with his own prejudices. For him, the color of the man's skin was sufficient grounds for suspicion. There was no need for evidence or clarification in his eyes. The man was already guilty. "Car documents and license," the policeman shouted, sharply extending his hand. The driver calmly took his ID out of his pocket, put it in the policeman's hand and continued to watch the policeman's face change as he read the name on the card. At first it was uncertainty, then real surprise, which he desperately tried to hide. "Are you kidding me?" The policeman quickly regained his composure, though his voice wavered. He glanced again at the ID, then at the man. The card read in black and white, "James Taylor, the new sheriff of the county." Everything the cop knew came crashing down in an instant. This man he'd thoughtlessly pulled over was his boss, the sheriff. But what to do now? How to turn the situation around so he could get away with it? The thought of his racist behavior becoming known to the entire department hit him like an electric shock. But James was slow to respond. He had long been accustomed to such encounters. He knew that his position did not protect him from the bias he encountered at every turn. Being a black sheriff in a small, predominantly white town meant one thing: constantly proving your right to the post. But he was patient and understood that such moments were not only personal challenges, but also opportunities to change something. "Do you really want to continue this conversation in this tone?" James asked calmly, looking closely at the policeman. The policeman tensed. He knew he had gone too far, but backing down now would mean admitting his guilt. He couldn't afford that, but continuing his aggression against the new sheriff wasn't the best idea either. The situation had reached a dead end, and every word could be fatal for him. In the stillness of the night, illuminated only by the headlights of the police car, James gave his opponent time to realize the absurdity and danger of his actions. There was no malice or desire for revenge in his eyes. He saw before him a man trapped in his own prejudices. "You know, I can understand why you do what you do." James finally broke the silence, his voice calm but filled with hidden strength. "You grew up in a world where you were taught to judge people by how they look, not by their actions. But if I were you, I'd wonder how far you're willing to go to protect your version of reality." The policeman no longer knew what to say. It felt like the ground was slipping out from under his feet. The sheriff's words sounded like a sentence, not a legal one, but a moral one. At that moment, his racist beliefs began to crack at the seams, and for the first time in his life, he began to think about what words like honor, justice, and equality really meant. The cop froze, his palms sweating, his heart pounding. He glanced at the ID in his hands again, as if that would make a difference. A wave of panic rose in his chest. The mistake was too obvious. Once word got back to the department, his career would be over. Under the flashing lights, Sheriff James Taylor's face remained impassive, though the cop could sense the hidden power in his eyes. This wasn't just another man who could be overwhelmed with brutality and authority. This was someone who saw right through you, and that made it all the more terrifying. "Listen," the policeman tried to start a conversation. His voice broke, but he collected his thoughts and continued. "This is some kind of misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." James nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off him. "Yes, it is a misunderstanding. You did your job. But a job isn't just about suspecting a person because of how they look. What if I really were someone else? What if you arrested an innocent person right now? What would happen next?" The policeman realized that the sheriff was not going to let him go easily. The fear that James would go further and report his behavior was growing. But in the back of his mind, there was another, more painful thought. Maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe he really was wrong. But he couldn't bear to admit it. I followed instructions. We were taught to pay attention to details. Suspicious behavior. Types. The words sounded like an excuse, but now the policeman himself did not believe them. The words crumbled like a house of cards when James took a step forward. "Types?" the sheriff asked, his voice quiet but accusing. "I wonder what type? A man dressed in a business suit, in a nice car, behaving politely, or is it enough to just be black?" The cop felt his heart tighten with shame. He tried to find the words to respond, but everything inside him froze. Never before had he been confronted with the consequences of his prejudices. Until now, such situations had seemed routine, familiar, a routine job, stopping a suspicious person. But now that this man stood before him as the new sheriff, the reality hit him harder than he could have imagined. James took another step closer, his face now very close to the policeman's, and his eyes showed the deep weariness of years of fighting for the right to be equal. "I meet people like you every day," the sheriff said, his voice laced with bitterness. "People who see me as a threat just because I was born the color of my skin. Do you think this is the first time I've seen that kind of treatment? Do you think I'm surprised?" The policeman looked away. He could no longer look James in the eye. There was too much truth in those words. All his confidence and power vanished in an instant. This was not just a man, but a symbol of how deeply ingrained the prejudices were in the system he served. "I didn't know. I didn't want to," the policeman began, but the sheriff stopped him with a gesture. "You wanted to. You wanted to believe that you were doing the right thing because that's what you were taught. But let's be honest, that's no excuse." James paused for a second, looking the policeman over the way the policeman had looked at him at the beginning, but there was no hatred in his gaze, only disappointment. At that moment, the sound of a police radio broke the silence. The officer flinched but did not answer, realizing that the most important thing now was to end this conversation. He expected the worst, that James would call the department, file a complaint, and his career would be over. But the sheriff suddenly lowered his head and let out a quiet breath. He knew perfectly well that it would be easy to expose this policeman. One phone call would be enough to ruin this man's career. But James saw this not as a solution to the problem, but just another cycle. One man would be removed, but another would take his place, with the same prejudices. The real fight was deeper. It was not about personal victories, but about changing the thinking of an entire society. "You know," the sheriff said, his voice rough, as if he'd been fighting this battle inside himself for years. "You can walk away from this and forget what happened, but you won't forget this lesson. Every time you pull a guy over, think about why you're doing it. Are you suspecting him because he's breaking the law, or because you're prejudiced?" The cop was silent, his head down. He felt like the sheriff was giving him a second chance, unofficially, without reports or complaints, but the lesson would stay with him forever. The sheriff's words would echo in his head every time he went on duty. James turned and headed for his car. He had done enough. This night could have been just another chapter in his long history of fighting bias, but maybe it would be a turning point for someone else. The policeman stood stock still, watching Sheriff James Taylor walk away toward his car. His thoughts fluttered like stunned birds in the small cage of his mind. The cold seemed to be gathering around him, and the tension was growing. He had been one step away from disaster, but somehow he felt no relief. Instead, there was a growing heaviness inside him that he couldn't explain. It was as if this man, the new sheriff, had left a wound in his life that would never heal. The policeman took a step forward, not understanding why. Something inside demanded an explanation, a justification, if only for his own sake. "Wait!" he shouted, not realizing what he was doing. James slowed his pace, but did not turn around. In the silence of the night, only a few meters separated them, but those meters seemed like an abyss. "I don't know how this happened," the policeman said, his tongue slurring. It seemed to him that this was his only chance to change something, at least in the eyes of the man in front of whom he now stood naked. It was wrong. I don't want to be like this. Hell, I don't even know why I did it. James finally turned, his face still stony. He remained silent, giving the policeman a chance to continue, as if testing him. I just don't want you to think that everyone is like this. The cop stuttered, the words struggling to come out. Not everyone is like me. We have good guys here. I lost my way. There was no surprise in James's eyes. He had heard this kind of talk before, many times, but something was different this time. Perhaps it was the sincerity that broke through the shame and fear, or perhaps the fact that the policeman had finally encountered something he could not explain in familiar words. James saw the man before him break down, his pride crumbling, and with it his false beliefs. "You want me to believe that this is just a mistake?" James finally said, his voice quiet but firm. There was no accusation in it, just a question that demanded an honest answer. "Or do you want to believe it yourself?" The cop looked away. It was as if James had read his mind. It wasn't just the color of his skin that had made him stop the car, or the suspicion of a crime. It was a whole bundle of fears, prejudices, and pressures that he had lived with for years without even noticing how it affected him. He was part of a system that fed these fears to him, making them a normal part of his life. "I don't know," he finally managed to say. "I really don't know. And that's the first step," James replied. "You're not the first one who doesn't know, and you won't be the last." The cop took a deep breath, as if for the first time that night. His mind was spinning with thoughts of what could have been. He could have gone the other way, put on a mask, hold on to his power, wriggle out of it. But perhaps for the first time in his life, he was confronted with something more significant than his own ego. He knew that James could have destroyed his career with a few words, but he hadn't, and that fact choked him more than any threat. "Why are you giving me this chance?" the policeman finally asked, looking at the sheriff. It was a simple question, but there was a desperation in it, as if he didn't understand why he wasn't being punished for such a gross mistake. James looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he should explain. Finally, he said softly, "If you punish people every time they make mistakes out of ignorance or fear, what will change? One life is destroyed, and in its place, bitterness grows. But if you begin to understand what is happening, if you realize that you are responsible for your actions, maybe it will change not only you, but others around you." The policeman froze. For the first time, he considered that his actions might not just ruin his life, but change others. James was talking about more, about the possibility of changing something within the system, about being better, even if it was harder than simply following the usual stereotypes. But even with this knowledge, the cop couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt. He looked at the sheriff and suddenly realized that he was confronted every day with something that he had only just discovered. This man lived in a world where bias was his constant companion, but he didn't let it break him. "I don't know if I can change," the policeman muttered under his breath. He felt his inner walls crumbling, and a frightening uncertainty was opening up before him. "But I want to try." James nodded, his gaze softening a little. "Change starts with desire, but remember, you are responsible for who you will be tomorrow. No one will do it for you." Silence hung in the air. The policeman realized that this conversation had changed him more than he could have expected. It was not just a lesson or a lecture, it was a confrontation with himself, with who he was and who he could become. "Get back on duty," James said, changing his tone abruptly, as if to bring the conversation back to a professional level. "And think about it." The policeman nodded and walked slowly towards his car, feeling each step as hard as he could. His mind was full of unanswerable questions, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never be the same again. And James stood by his car, watching the officer climb into his cruiser and drive off into the night. He knew that today he had planted the seeds of doubt and, perhaps, change, but there was a long way to go, both for this city and for society as a whole. As the squad car disappeared into the night, James Taylor stood beside his car, staring down the dark road, as if listening to the echoes of the conversation. He wanted to believe that the words had sunk in, that this would be a turning point for him, but the sheriff had had experience. Too many times he had encountered people who said the right things, only to fall back into their old ways. James opened his car door, ready to drive away, when police lights flashed in the distance again. He frowned. Something is wrong, he thought, and stopped. The tension inside him returned, as if something had been wrong all along. The car pulled closer, and James noticed that it was the same patrol car that had just left. The policeman stepped out of the car, his face grim, and James felt something ominous in the air. "Is something wrong?" the sheriff asked, suspicion rising inside him. The cop was holding what looked like a walkie-talkie, and he was clutching it nervously, his eyes darting around. "I need you to come with me," the policeman said, his voice strangely strained. "It's urgent." "What's the matter?" James straightened up, alert. "We're just going." The officer avoided a direct answer, which only increased the sheriff's suspicions. His intuition, the feeling that had saved him more than once in the past, was screaming that something was wrong. "Care to explain?" James didn't move, his voice growing firmer. The policeman hesitated, then reluctantly said, "There's been a tip-off about you, that you're connected to a recent robbery." The words struck like a bolt from the blue. James almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation, but the coldness in the policeman's voice made him freeze. "Are you serious?" James stepped forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "You know who I am, the sheriff, and you're going to make that accusation again?" But the cop didn't move, his face remained cold, as if something had happened in the last few minutes that James didn't understand. He felt the threat growing, and suddenly he realized that it wasn't just this one cop anymore. There was something bigger going on behind the scenes, and he was just beginning to understand it. "It's not my decision," the policeman finally said, his voice quiet, almost guilty. "There's a call from Central. A man who looks like you is involved in an armed robbery. They want me to bring you in for questioning." James felt anger welling up inside him, but he knew it would be dangerous to lose control. This all seemed like a setup, a trap gone wrong, reminding him once again of what he had been fighting all. "A man my size?" the sheriff repeated, his voice like steel. "Do you realize how ridiculous this is? Do you realize what this looks like?" The policeman looked away, his hands shaking, and for a moment he looked broken, but then he looked back at the sheriff, as if forcing himself to say something. "I know what it looks like," he said slowly, "but it comes from the very top. I can't argue with orders." James stared at him, steeling himself. He knew the system he worked in was rife with racism, and this was yet another example of that. And yet, even as sheriff, he was once again confronted with the same reality he was trying to change. "Okay," James said, suddenly calm, "I'll go with you, but believe me, if this is some kind of game, the consequences will affect everyone." The cop breathed a sigh of relief, though he was still clearly tense. He nodded and opened the rear door of the patrol car, gesturing for James to get in. As they drove away, James tried to understand what exactly had happened. How could this have happened? They knew him in this town. They knew who he was. Who could have given such an absurd order? But one thing was clear, it was not just suspicion. Someone had decided to use the system against him. As the car moved through the deserted streets, James felt a dark web of intrigue surrounding him, and then it dawned on him, maybe this wasn't a random incident. Maybe someone was deliberately trying to get rid of him, knowing that he was in the way of something bigger, maybe even the corruption he threatened in his work. Someone knew he wouldn't back down, and decided to hit him where it hurt most. Finally, the car pulled up outside the department building, but instead of getting out and heading into the building, the officer stayed in the car, staring intently at the rearview mirror. This did not seem like standard procedure. "What now?" James asked, looking warily at the policeman. "They're waiting there." The policeman nodded toward the dark building, fear flickering in his eyes. "But I want to say something before we go in." James frowned. The policeman looked around as if he was afraid of being overheard, and finally spoke quietly, as if this conversation was mortally dangerous. "This isn't just a mistake. You're being targeted," he whispered. "Whoever's behind this wants you out. You've become too visible. They think you'll start digging into people they shouldn't touch." James felt a cold sweat run down his body. Everything fell into place. Someone was pulling the strings, trying to use prejudice and racism against him to get rid of a dangerous enemy. But who? "And you helped them?" James asked quietly, feeling his anger rising again. The policeman pressed his lips together and pain flashed in his eyes. "No, but if I don't, they'll destroy me just like they did you." "Who are they?" James asked. But at that moment the door of the building swung open and two men in black suits approached the car. The policeman looked at James with regret, but said nothing. The men opened the door of the patrol car and motioned for the sheriff to get out. James exhaled, realizing that this night was just beginning, and that there were more dangerous opponents ahead than he could have imagined. James stepped out of the car slowly, looking carefully at the two men in black suits. They were clearly not local cops. Their stern, distant faces and confident posture suggested they were men of a different level of authority. Something about their demeanor suggested agents accustomed to control and manipulation. James felt his body tense, a voice inside him telling him that something dangerous and unpredictable was unfolding ahead. One of the men motioned for James to follow him. Without a word, the sheriff complied, though every cell in his body was ready to fight. He knew that resisting right now would be a mistake. He needed to figure out what was going on, and who was really behind this plot. Leading him through the halls of the police department, they climbed a narrow staircase that turned out to lead to the back office. James knew this wasn't standard procedure. Someone suspected of a crime clearly shouldn't be taken to such a place, and that made him even more suspicious. Finally, they came to a door, and one of the men opened it. James walked inside and immediately felt that the situation had changed. It was not an interrogation room, as he had expected, but a luxuriously furnished office with a massive desk and leather chairs. Behind the desk sat a man who was immediately recognizable as a figure of influence. He did not look like a civil servant or a policeman, more like a businessman accustomed to power and money. "Sheriff Taylor," he said slowly, not standing up. His eyes slid coldly over James, assessing him as a predator might assess its prey. "Sit down." James remained standing, unmoving. "Who are you, and what is this farce?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in his smile. He spread his hands slightly, as if introducing himself. "You know who I am, or at least you should have guessed. You've been flirting with forces far greater than yourselves for too long, and now we're here." James felt a spark of realization within him. He thought back to the last few months of his job, the sudden problems with investigations, the pressing hints from influential people in the city, and of course the recent attempts to expose a scheme involving illegal deals and local construction contracts. Now it all made sense. "You're the kind of guy who thinks he can run this city from the shadows, behind the police," James said, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was calm, but there was an icy confidence in it. "And now that I've gotten too close, you've decided to take me out." The man shook his head with a slight grin. "No, Sheriff, it's not that simple. We don't want to take out you. Quite the contrary, we consider you a valuable resource. Someone like you could be much more useful if he ended up on our side." James frowned. It sounded like a subtle threat, veiled as an offer. He had seen this kind of scheme before, when corrupt elites tried to bribe or intimidate people into becoming their puppets. "You want me to be your ally?" he asked coldly, "after you tried to frame me and make me out to be a criminal? Set me up." The man spread his hands, feigning surprise. "Oh, Sheriff, you underestimate our generosity. It was just a test. We just wanted to see how ready you were to defend your principles, and I must admit, you have proven yourself to be a steadfast man. However, everything can change." James sensed that there was something much darker behind the man's words. These people weren't just part of a corrupt system. They ran that system from the inside, controlling politics, the economy, and even law enforcement. Racism was just one of the tools they used to maintain their way of life. "What do you want?" James asked, although he already knew the answer. The man stood up from his chair and came closer, his gaze icy. "We want you to stop digging where you shouldn't, to start working with us, not against us. We can give you anything you want: money, influence, power. All we ask in return is loyalty." James stood silently, looking at the man. The offer would have been tempting to anyone else: career advancement, security, prestige. But to him, it was tantamount to betraying everything he had fought for. "And what if I refuse?" the sheriff asked calmly, his eyes gleaming coldly. "What if I continue to do my job?" The man nodded, as if he had anticipated this question. "Then we will destroy you. We will find a way. You have seen how easy it is to do this. One phone call, and you are already a suspect. One false step and your career is over. Your reputation is ruined. You understand that this is only the beginning?" James felt the rage building inside him, but he kept his cool. He had seen many people like this in his life, those who thought their power was unlimited, but they always made the same mistake. They underestimated those who were willing to fight to the end. "You want to buy me?" he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But I'm not for sale. I'll keep working, and if you try anything, know that I'm not alone. This city deserves better than to be a puppet to the likes of you." The man looked at James and slowly bowed his head, as if acknowledging his fortitude. "That's too bad. But trust me, "Sheriff, this will be your last mistake." He motioned to his men, who stepped toward James, ready to detain him, but the sheriff was already prepared. In an instant, he spun around and punched one of them, knocking him off balance. The second tried to grab him, but James, with years of experience, dodged and threw him to the floor. The room filled with the sound of falling bodies and groans. The man at the table watched calmly, not moving. James knew this wasn't the end. Getting out of here was just the first step. James, exhausted, was left momentarily confused, trying to comprehend what was happening. His mind was spinning with thoughts of how he had ended up in this hell, where betrayal and corruption were the norm. He knew that if he got out of here, he would have to fight not only for his life, but for justice. His heart sank as he looked around the room for an exit. The door was ajar, and footsteps could be heard in the hallway outside this gloomy office. Judging by the sounds, someone else was approaching, and there was very little time left. As James struggled with the two men, he felt anger and adrenaline coursing through his body, giving him strength. He knew he had to act fast. Before they could even process what was happening, he was out of the room, racing down the hallway, and into the service areas. He had just turned the corner when he was hit by flashes of light and the sounds of shouting, voices calling for order. The thought of being caught began to condense in James's mind. In that moment, he felt like all his efforts might be in vain. The system he was trying to expose was tightening its net around him, and now he had to make a choice, fight or flee. James rushed into the nearest room, closed the door behind him and covered his mouth with his hand, trying not to make a sound. His heart was pounding in his chest like a wounded animal. He listened to the footsteps outside the door, building up tension. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the door, and James realized that there was no point in hiding any longer. There were those behind the door who were not going to retreat. He concentrated again and waited until they tried to open the door. But to his horror, a loud shot was heard. This was something new. James's heart sank when he realized that his opponents were ready to take extreme measures. "Get him!" one of them shouted. As he stood in the shelter, James thought about his life. He remembered how much being a sheriff meant to him. Helping people, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, that had always been his calling. But now, standing on the edge of the abyss, he realized that even with the most noble goal, his life could end here and now. More banging was heard and the doors began to swing open. At that moment, James felt fear wash over him, fear for himself and for the people he wanted to protect. He quickly looked around the room and noticed a window overlooking the backyard. The path to freedom was difficult, but there was no other choice. Gathering all his strength, he rushed to the window and threw it open. Outside, he was met by darkness. Deep shadows hid unseen dangers, but it was better than staying in a building that threatened to kill him. He jumped, landing on the soft grass, and quickly scrambled to his feet, trying not to waste time. But he soon realized that it wasn't as easy as he had hoped. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. Someone was on his tail, and the sudden realization made his heart beat even faster. He dashed toward a dark alley, hoping to find shelter. James ran through the flooded streets, cutting through the night's silence. When it hit him, he was not only running from people who wished him harm, but from the very system he once defended. The constant stream of thoughts about how his life could have been different made his heart flutter. Why did this happen? He thought painfully, trying to ignore the fear that was gripping his mind. But then a familiar silhouette appeared on his path, his best friend, Liam, who worked in the investigation department. "James," he shouted, running up. "What's going on? I heard shots." James wasted no time explaining the situation, and Liam's face took on a look of genuine shock. "You can't go back there," he said. "They want you out. I heard they're planning a whole operation to eliminate you if you continue your work. It's not just a detention." James nodded, aware that their conversation might attract unwanted attention. He pulled Liam along with him, trying to find cover. Their footsteps echoed through the deserted streets, and soon they found themselves in an abandoned construction site, where wild grass and trees were already growing. "We don't have time," James said, his voice shaking with excitement. "I need proof. I know they're doing something illegal, and if I can prove it." Liam interrupted him. "But it's dangerous. You don't even know who's behind this." "I can't just walk away," James insisted. "I can't let them kill my dream and everything I built. I have to act." Liam looked at James with concern, but knew his friend wouldn't back down. They began discussing their plan of action when suddenly voices came from around the corner. "There they are," shouted one of the policemen. "Run!" Fear began to rise in James's heart. They were already trapped, and if they couldn't escape quickly, they might end up in the hands of those who wanted to destroy them. "We have to go," James shouted, pointing to the corridor leading to another exit. They ran into the darkness, but the footsteps were getting closer, and James's heartbeat began to pound in his head. He knew that he couldn't lose this time. He knew that there was an enemy waiting around every corner, and his only hope was Liam. Running out to the other side of the square, they noticed the light of lanterns, which the through alleys led them to. "This way," James shouted, and they rushed towards the nearest shelter, an old garage. It was dark and quiet inside. The friends froze, trying to listen to the sounds outside. "We need to find a way to get evidence," Liam said quietly. "I can try to use my connections." "What if they find out?" James asked tensely. "We need to be careful." At that moment there was a crash, the garage door swung open with a dull thud, and a policeman with a flashlight stumbled in. His eyes met James and Liam, and he smiled menacingly. "Did you think you could escape?" he said, turning to them. James clenched his fists, his inner voice demanding to fight. They were trapped, and this time he knew there was no turning back. Liam moved toward him, ready to fight, but James stopped him. "No need," he said quietly. "We can solve this another way." The policeman, not expecting such a turn of events, froze in confusion. James began to speak, slowly and confidently, hoping that his words would find a response. "We know that you are not working for what brings good to people. You are serving those who are destroying this city. Why? For what? It is none of your business." The policeman listened, his head slightly bowed. James knew he had a chance. "You can make the right choice. Instead of serving corruption, you can use your power to help. I am ready to take you with me if you want to do what is right." For a moment, doubt flashed in the policeman's eyes. It was a moment that could change everything. But suddenly, footsteps came from behind him. James and Liam saw several men in uniform approaching them, and James's heart sank. He knew that now their whole fight could end in tragedy. The situation had become critical. The policeman turned, his expression wary, and everything around him turned into chaos. James felt his hopes crumble as he was tackled and thrown to the floor. His mind was filled with thoughts that perhaps this would be the end of his fight for justice, and he would become another victim of the system. At that moment, his inner voice became louder. "Don't give up." He knew he had to fight, even if everything around him was falling apart. Time passed, and when the doors swung open again, a figure appeared on the threshold, a man in a formal suit. It was the same influential businessman James had seen in the office. His confident appearance and composure were puzzling. "What's going on here?" he asked, stepping inside. As James tried to catch his breath, his thoughts were focused on one thing: how justice could be restored. He knew he had an opportunity now. The words he spoke were his last chance. "It's not their fault. I'm the only one who's to blame. I tried to do everything right, but I failed. If you need punishment, I'm ready to take responsibility." Surprise flashed in the businessman's eyes. James felt his words taking effect, and it gave him strength. "There is no need to punish anyone," he said. "Just stop it. I know what you want to do, and I will help you." Complex emotions filled the room: fear, hope, and tragedy. James knew this was only a small step towards change, but he was willing to fight for it. But at that moment there was a noise outside the door, and the whole world that James had been prepared to believe in was threatened again. The walls were closing in on him, and for a moment he felt as if all hope was lost. It was only a few moments before silence filled the space again, but it was only the beginning of a new, greater struggle, a struggle for justice, hope, and truth in a world where many were battling their own demons. Now he has only one goal: to survive, to make the voice of truth heard, and to free those who have become victims of the system from the yoke of corruption and betrayal. James felt the will to act grow within him. Every word this powerful man had spoken gave him hope, but the reality was still dangerous. The narrowing of space in this room was a physical sensation, and he knew he could not afford to waver. Suddenly the doors burst open again and uniformed police officers came barreling into the office, clutching their batons and pepper spray. James stood up abruptly, a look of determination on his face. "Stop!" he shouted, trying to get attention. "I'm ready to take responsibility for everything that happened. I'll cooperate. Just give me a chance." The lieutenant at the head of the group raised his eyebrows, but didn't have time to say anything. To his surprise, the businessman standing next to James stepped forward. "Leave them alone," he said, his voice commanding. "We have a chance to do this right. Let's be reasonable." The policemen exchanged puzzled glances. The situation was getting worse, and James felt that there was tension in the air that could explode at any second. "Do you know who he is?" The businessman pointed at James. "He's the new sheriff. His actions are important to our city. I want you to step back and give him a chance to explain himself." The lieutenant looked at him with distrust. "What role are you playing here? It's none of your business." "I am here precisely to ensure safety," the businessman said calmly. "And if we allow these events to develop, the consequences will be catastrophic." James, wasting no time, decided to take advantage of the moment. He stepped forward and addressed the police. "This is not just a conversation about who is right and who is wrong. I will not remain silent. I did not become sheriff to hide behind people's backs. I am here to work for the people of this city, and that is why I will do everything in my power to expose those who use their power to manipulate and fear." One of the policemen, looking at James with bewilderment, seemed to begin to doubt, but the lieutenant was adamant. "Too much talk, Sheriff. You need to surrender." James knew his words might not work, but something inside him demanded he fight. At that moment, his thoughts turned to the people he was fighting for, those who were suffering because of the system that had ruined their lives. His life had no meaning if he didn't fight for them. "Listen," he said, the rage beginning to overwhelm him. "I will not allow you to bully me or the people of this city. I did not come here to hide, nor did I come here to be bribed. I am here to expose the truth, and if you cannot see that, the whole system will collapse." The lieutenant merely smirked, eyeing James with disdain. "Your ideals are just words. We will simply do what it takes to eliminate you." The businessman intervened again. "That's not what we need. Let's work together to make this city safe for everyone." But before anyone could say anything, there was shouting and footsteps outside. It was more than just ordinary noise. James recognized the hum. It was protesters gathering in the streets. They had come to express their dissatisfaction with the police. And now it was a dangerous spark in an already simmering situation. "We have to get out of here," he said, looking at the businessman. "This is getting out of control. We have to unite with the people and do everything we can to prevent violence." The businessman nodded, and James turned to the policeman. "I suggest you take control of the situation, instead of keeping us in this office. Let's go outside and see what's going on." The lieutenant paused for a moment, as if considering the possibility, but another policeman standing nearby said, "We can't just leave, Sheriff. We need your directions." "Don't wait for orders," James replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're all on the same side. This is our chance to make a difference." The lieutenant took a step back, as if he were hesitating. The situation was changing, and now they faced a choice: continue to serve a system that was failing them, or be part of the change. At that moment, the door swung open again and more police officers rushed in, followed by a crowd of people with signs. Shouts came from the street, demanding change, justice, and an end to police brutality. The crowd looked tense but determined. They knew their presence could make a difference, and they were there to stand up for their rights. James looked at the people and his heart filled with pride. They were there, ready to support him in this fight. He knew that they were his true strength. "We have the power to change something," he shouted to the crowd. "Together, we can make a difference and create a society where everyone is equal. We can change our city." The crowd responded with cheers and support. The moment united them, and James, who felt the world changing around him, was able to breathe deeply. But the joy was short-lived. The police lieutenant, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, shouted, "Don't let them get away! Eliminate them!" The crowd began to roar, and James knew the fight was just beginning. Things were heating up, and soon they would find themselves in the eye of a hurricane. He knew their fight was not limited to this building. They would have to fight in the streets, in the minds and hearts of the people, to bring justice and hope back to the city. James gathered his thoughts and decided to act. He saw a group of people approaching them and shouted, "If we want to change the system, we need to unite. I call on each of you to become part of the change. We must fight for the truth together." The crowd, caught up in the excitement, began chanting his name. James felt like his whole life and fight for justice had reached a culmination. This moment was a turning point. But it was at that moment that the silence was broken by gunshots. The police began to disperse the crowd, and James, feeling the world around him crumbling, rushed forward to protect those who had come for the truth. "Go away," he shouted, trying to protect the people from the madness unfolding in the street. But something inside him knew that this fight would not end. This was just the first chapter in their long and tragic story, and he was ready to fight to the end. With every step forward, James felt his will grow stronger. He knew he couldn't turn around and stop. He was the new sheriff, but it was more than just a job title now. It was his duty to fight for the people, for their rights, for their freedom. The crowd was leading the way, and James knew they were not alone. This story was just beginning, and he was willing to risk everything to change the future. James knew that his life and the lives of many others depended on how he handled this critical situation. The confrontation on the street became as important as his internal confrontation with the racism and bias that were part of the system he once served. The crowd screamed against oppression, and in that scream, James heard his own inner suffering. He knew that many of these people were victims of the system, and now that he was sheriff, he had the power to change that. But he also knew that the system wasn't just his enemy, it was a part of him, and that realization weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, the sounds of protest were growing louder. The police officers gathered in the square began to act, their uniforms and muscles intimidating. James noticed several officers clenching their fists, preparing for violence. "Don't let them disperse," the lieutenant shouted, and this was the signal for the conflict to begin. James took a step back, his heart pounding. He knew he had to take responsibility at this point, or this would all end in disaster. But he wasn't going to walk away. He knew he had more than just a crowd behind him, but a lot of people who relied on him. He couldn't betray them. "Stop," he shouted, raising his hands to stop the violence. "We are here to seek justice, not to fight each other." But the crowd, gripped by fear and anger, did not listen. James knew that the situation was escalating, and that if something was not done now, the consequences could be dire. At this point, in the midst of this chaotic scene, he noticed someone who stood up from the crowd, a woman holding a sign that read, "Down with racism." She stood at the front of the crowd, her face set in determination. James felt that her resilience was inspiring the others. But it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. One of the policemen, sensing the growing tension, fired a shot into the air. There was a loud noise and the crowd froze. The smell of fear was in the air, and James knew that this was the moment that could change everything. "This is not a solution," he shouted, looking into the eyes of the officer who had opened fire. "Put your guns away." But the lieutenant didn't seem to be giving in. He grabbed his partner by the shoulder and shouted, "It's our job. We have to put things in order." For a moment, James felt anger boiling inside him. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Thinking back to all the racism and bias he had faced in his career, he suddenly realized that this wasn't just his personal fight. It was a battle for everyone who had ever suffered under the system. "I am no longer a sheriff who will hide behind his laws," he said, looking the policeman in the eye. "I am here to serve the people, not a system that divides and destroys." The crowd began to roar again, and it spurred him on. In that moment, a flame was lit inside him that would not go out. He knew he could not allow this system to continue to operate with impunity. This was his chance to challenge not just the police, but society as a whole. But then another shot rang out. This time it came from the crowd. James turned around, his heart sinking as he saw the woman with the sign in front of him collapse to the ground. Panicking, he ran towards her, pushing his way through the crowd. "No!" he shouted when he reached her. There was desperation in his eyes as he saw her lying unconscious and people gathering around her. "Please don't go!" There was chaos all around. People were screaming. Someone was trying to help, but James knew they didn't have much time. "Who shot?" he shouted, raising his head. "Who dared to do this?" The lieutenant, still holding his gun, looked at James with hostility. "It was just an accident. Sheriff, you know what's going on. The crowd is out of control." "This is not an accident. This is a crime," James said with hatred, looking into the officer's eyes. He knew that at this moment it was necessary not only to fight for the woman, but also for the truth. Through the noise, James felt one of his former subordinates approaching him, Mark, who was a lieutenant and always supported James until he became sheriff. "James, we have to go," Mark whispered, trying to hide the fear in his voice. This could turn into something terrible. But James was relentless. He couldn't leave. This wasn't just a clash between police and protesters. This was a clash between life and death, between truth and lies, and he couldn't let it go. "I'm not leaving until I find out what happened," he said with determination. The lieutenant, his fists clenched, began to approach, and James felt the tension building. Every person in the square was waiting for his decision, and he knew he had to be the one to lead them to the truth. But suddenly, sirens began to sound as more police rushed to the scene, and James realized the situation was becoming catastrophic. The protesters were starting to panic, and his only chance was to get the situation under control before violence erupted. "Calm down," he shouted, standing in front of the crowd. "I'm here to protect you. We must show that peace is our only way." But then his gaze fell on the woman, who was still lying on the ground. He saw her body begin to tremble. "Help her," he shouted. "Someone call an ambulance." The crowd went silent, and in that moment, James felt his own inner demons begin to surface. He remembered his mother, who had told him of injustices, of how racism was tearing their community apart. Now he was part of that story, and this wasn't just his fight. He knew he had to keep going. This was his chance to do what was right. "We will not remain silent," he shouted. "We will fight for those who have suffered under this system. We will fight for our freedom and equality for all." But then suddenly there was a crackling sound. It was the silence that preceded the storm. A man in dark clothing stepped out from the crowd, walking slowly toward James, his face determined, but his eyes fearful. "I know what you're doing," he said quietly. "I know you want to change things, but you're not alone. This isn't just your fight." James was wary. This man was a well-known activist in their area, and his presence meant that something big was going on. "We can unite," the activist continued. "We have strength in unity, and now that we are all here, we can make our voices heard." James felt a surge of energy. Perhaps this was just what they needed. He turned to the crowd and shouted, "We are here to change the situation, and if we are together, no one can stop us." The crowd erupted in cheers, and James felt more and more people beginning to believe in the power of change. But at the same time, he knew that with that excitement came responsibility. "We have to be careful," he said, addressing the activists. "Our goal is justice, but we cannot act on emotions. We have to be smart." The activist nodded, and James, feeling supported, addressed the crowd. "We must show that we are united, that our voices can make a difference. Let us be peaceful, but let us not be intimidated. Our lives matter, and we will not remain silent any longer." And then, with the air filled with anger and hope, the crowd moved forward. But before they could take a step, more shots rang out. This time, they weren't just sounds, they were cars driving by, signaling that the police were about to launch a real attack. James saw the police officers starting to form a line, preparing for conflict. Fear was brewing in his mind, but he knew he had to act. "Attention," he shouted, raising his hands. "Don't let yourself be intimidated. We are here to fight for the truth, and we will not allow ourselves to be stopped." Meanwhile, he noticed someone in the crowd throwing rocks at the police. This was what he had been afraid of. The protest had turned violent, and it could have been disastrous. "No!" he shouted, wanting to stop the people. "We cannot respond to violence with violence. This is not the way." But the sound of breaking glass and loud screams echoed around him. Everything he knew about justice began to crumble in an instant. The situation was out of control, and he knew that if he didn't do something immediately, the consequences could be unpredictable. James rushed to the front row of protesters and tried to stop them. "Listen," he shouted, "if we let this go on, we won't achieve anything. We'll just be victims of the system." But there was a murmur in response to his words. The people were angry and ready to fight. At that moment, James felt his own hope begin to fade. How long could he continue this struggle? He had no answer. And the only thing he could do was try to lead those who were ready for change. But then something unexpected happened. A man ran into the crowd, and James recognized him immediately. It was his college friend, Mike, who had once witnessed injustice in their neighborhood. "James," he shouted, pushing his way through the crowd, "we have proof. We can make these events known." James paused. This could be a turning point in their fight. He saw Mike pull out several videos from his backpack, taken during previous protests. They captured police brutality and the bias with which they acted. "If we show this," Mike continued, "they won't be able to deny it. It will be proof that racism is still alive and needs to be stopped. James felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this was the moment they could hold the system accountable for its actions. "Let's do it," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "We'll show that we're not just words, we're taking action." Suddenly, the situation escalated to the limit. The police, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, began to act. James knew that time was running out. He had to act before someone got hurt. "Everyone back," he shouted, trying to maintain order. "We will not allow ourselves to be overcome by violence." His voice was a call for unity. He knew this wasn't just his fight, it was the fight of all those who had suffered from racism and prejudice. He felt the crowd begin to gather around him, and it gave him strength. With each passing moment, he realized that this wasn't just his story, it was the story of everyone who dreamed of change. And at that moment, when he was facing danger, he knew that he had to fight to the end. As the police approached, James raised his hand with the video footage. "This is evidence. We'll show you how you did it." The police stopped, and James felt his voice begin to resonate in the hearts of people. This moment could be the beginning of something bigger, a real fight for justice that needed brave hearts willing to stand up to the system. But it was also the beginning of a new tragedy, for every step forward led them into the unknown. He knew that the fight was not over, but now that they were together, it gave him hope that they could change their history. The events in the square were moving at lightning speed. For James, feeling the weight of not only his own personal history but also the hopes of hundreds of people on his shoulders, it became crystal clear, now or never. His heart pounded, and his mind raced with thoughts of what he might lose, not just his career, but the people he knew and the community he grew up in. The crowd around him rose up, acting as a flame to fuel the anger, but James felt they could also be a source of hope. "We will not give in to fear," he shouted, raising the videotapes above his head. "These tapes will show everyone who is who. This is our chance." There was a sparkle of determination in his eyes, but in the midst of the tense atmosphere, standing in the foreground, he noticed someone running out of the crowd, clutching a hammer. It was one of the locals, known for his temperament. James knew he was a good man, but his hatred of police and racism could play a cruel joke. "Hey!" James shouted, raising his hand, but it was too late. The hammer flew into the air and there was a loud crash as the glass of one of the police cars shattered. A second, and everything changed. "Look!" the lieutenant shouted, pointing at James. "This sheriff has lost control. We need to act." The police, without waiting for orders, began to form a line, preparing to disperse. James, feeling the fear filling the atmosphere, rushed towards the activist who was holding the notes. "We must show this to the public before it's too late," he shouted, grabbing him by the shoulder. But the activist looked confused, clutching the notes as if they were precious cargo. "But how? They won't let us do that. It could lead to violence." "We can do it," James replied with determination. "If we don't show the truth, we won't change anything." At that moment, another shot rang out, this time from a patrol car. That was the last straw. Tension and fear filled the air. The protesters began to panic and scatter, creating chaos. James knew this was his moment. He quickly jumped on the car and, calling to the crowd, shouted, "Stop! Don't run away! We must stay together, otherwise we will let the system win again." But his words were drowned out by the noise. People, overcome with fear, ran in all directions. James saw one of the young protesters, looking at his friend who had fallen to the ground, shout, "Whoever did this must be caught." And that was the moment when everything stopped mattering. Anger and despair began to take over. The crowd, previously united, began to disintegrate into groups. "We have to go," someone shouted, and at the same moment there was a crash of glass and another protester fell, colliding with a police shield. James felt more and more people leaving the square, leaving him alone. He looked at the activist again, but he seemed to have lost faith as well. "They can't hear us," he said, and James noticed his voice wavering. "There's nothing we can do." And it was at that moment, when hope began to fade, that James saw something that would change his life forever. A woman he knew came around the corner of the building. It was his mother, Laura, an activist and longtime advocate for black rights. She burst into tears when she saw her son in the chaos. "James," she screamed, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on? Are you safe?" His heart sank with fear. How could she come here? He had always wanted to protect her from all the troubles this world brought. "Mom, go away," he shouted, but she didn't listen. She came closer, determination shining in her eyes. "I'm not leaving until I see you're safe," she said, and there was a strength in her voice that gave him hope. But at that moment, another shot rang out and the crowd, frightened, began to scream again. James felt panic sweep through his body as he realized that his mother could be the next victim of violence. "Stop!" he shouted, trying to shield her from the people rushing in different directions. "We have to leave." But the moment he tried to pull her out of the crowd, something strange happened. The people shouting and protesting suddenly froze. Their faces showed bewilderment, fear, and even confusion. Another police car pulled up from around the corner, and on board were not just any officers, but those who were known for their brutality. "Get him out!" one of the policemen shouted, pointing at James. "He's a criminal." The words came out of nowhere. James's heart began to pound as he realized that he was being cast as an outcast. He was the sheriff, and now his position was under threat. "That's not true," he shouted, trying to clarify the situation. "I'm here to protect people." But the policemen were adamant. Suddenly one of them grabbed him by the shoulder, and James felt the ground slipping out from under his feet. "Don't you dare touch him," Laura screamed, standing between James and the policeman. "Mom, don't interfere," he shouted, but she stood her ground. "You can't take my son," she said forcefully, and James felt her words melt the ice in his heart. But that didn't stop the police. They grabbed James, and at that moment, when his body was pulled to the ground, he felt everything collapse. The faces of those who fought for justice flashed in his eyes, and in his heart there was only pain. The crowd began to panic again. The place soon became a battlefield, with protesters throwing rocks and police responding with batons and tear gas. James, on the ground, realized he was a hostage to the system he once wanted to change. And then he saw his mother, trying to protect him, fall to the ground. At that moment, his heart was torn apart by pain, and rage filled his body. "Mom!" he screamed, unable to contain his emotions. He got out of the police's hands and, as he quickly stood up, saw that complete chaos had broken out around him. Protesters and policemen were fighting, sparing no effort. "Hey, Sheriff!" someone from the crowd shouted. "This is your fault." James, looking at everything that was happening, felt bitterness filling his soul. He tried to explain that he was not here to fight, but to protect, but his voice was lost in the abyss of noise. Seconds turned into hours as he tried to find his mother in the chaos. Finally, when he saw her, all his fears and hopes merged into one moment. She was lying on the ground, and his heart was breaking with horror. "Mom!" he shouted, making his way towards her. But the police were relentless. They began using force to disperse the crowd, and he knew he had to act quickly. "I won't leave you," James said, moving through the chaos, feeling the war raging around him. His hands shook with fear, but his determination only grew stronger. He knew that if he didn't get to his mother, he would never be able to forgive himself. The crowd continued to scream. The police escalated their actions, using batons and tear gas. Tears and screams mixed in the air, creating an atmosphere of hopelessness. But James was not going to give up. He pushed through the people, dodging blows and trying not to step on broken glass. When he finally reached Laura, she was on the ground, her face contorted in pain and suffering. James's eyes filled with horror. "Mom, what's wrong with you?" he said in a breaking voice, leaning towards her. "I'm fine," she said, raising her head with difficulty. "But you have to get out of here, James. They don't know who they're dealing with." "No, I can't leave you," he cried, realizing that this could be their last moment together. At that moment, the police saw them and pointed their flashlights in their direction. One of the officers who had grabbed James earlier soon ran up to them, his face indifferent. "You're both under arrest," he shouted, trying to be heard above the noise around him. James felt despair wash over him. He couldn't believe that at the moment when he was closest to his mother, he was about to be taken away. "She did nothing wrong," he shouted, coming to Laura's defense. "We just want justice." "Justice?" The policeman laughed, his face amused. "You're the sheriff, right? So you're the one who should have been keeping order." Anger flared inside James. He knew it wasn't true. All his efforts, all his fight for the rights of black people in this city, were simply being ignored. He stepped between the policeman and his mother. "You're not taking her," he said, raising his hands to show he didn't want any aggression. but as he tried to protect Laura, the policeman pulled out his baton and hit James in the back. He fell to the ground, feeling sharp pain, but not letting himself give in. "Mom!" he screamed, trying to get up, but his body was weak from the blow. Laura fell to her knees, bleeding from the blow, her heart breaking for her son. "James, go away!" she shouted, but he couldn't. "I won't leave you," he repeated, as if this phrase could protect them both. And then there was a new noise, the sound of sirens, growing louder, like an approaching hurricane. More police cars were approaching the square, and soon there was a siege around them. The crowd of protesters, overcome with fear and anger, tried to resist, but James felt his hope draining away. Everything they had planned seemed to be falling apart before their eyes. The police started acting aggressively and chaos reigned in the square. People tried to run away. Some started throwing stones at cars, but this only made the situation worse. "We have to leave," someone from the crowd shouted, but this caused even more panic. People ran in different directions, and soon the square was filled with screams and cries. James felt his strength draining away. He knew he should take his mother and leave, but in that moment, as if time had slowed down, he saw one of the police officers point his gun at the crowd. That was the moment when everything changed. "Don't shoot!" he shouted, realizing that this time he might not be able to save anyone. But instead he saw his voice, filled with fear and determination, reflected in the policeman's eyes. The officer froze, and then, as if confused, put his weapon away. "What are you doing here, Sheriff?" he said, looking at James with hatred. "I'm trying to save my mother," James shouted, and then added, "You can't continue this madness. This is not our way." And that was what James realized in that moment. They weren't just fighting for their rights, they were fighting for their lives. He realized that their fight against racism and violence wasn't just an ideology, it was real life that needed to be protected. And when his words reverberated through the crowd, their eyes began to understand. People began to unite. Even in their fear, they realized that only together could they resist the system that oppressed them. "We're not here for violence," someone from the crowd shouted. "We're here for change." And in that moment, something changed in the atmosphere. James felt hope return to them. He turned to his mother, and in her eyes he saw the same determination. "We will do this together," she said, her voice full of strength. The crowd, seeing their unity, began to gather around them, forming a barricade in front of the police. At that moment, James realized that they were all here for one thing: justice. This was their time. Their fight is not over, but now they have the strength to continue. They will not let fear separate them. Through the chaos and the noise, through the panic and the fear, they decided they would fight to the last. And that moment, when they embraced and united in their fight, was the beginning of a new era, an era in which they would no longer allow themselves to be suppressed. But despite this, there was a difficult struggle ahead. James knew they would face new resistance, and this could be their last attempt. The tragedy and drama of their lives were intertwined, and every action, every emotion could be fatal. He looked at the crowd, seeing in their faces the same determination that burned in his heart. In that moment, he promised himself and everyone around him, he would not stop until he saw that justice had been served, and his mother, like all of them, would no longer suffer from prejudice and hatred. "For justice," he shouted, and the crowd took up his words with enthusiasm. And so, they all moved forward together, ready to fight, ready to do anything to change their destiny. It was the beginning of a new struggle, but they knew that together they could overcome any difficulties. The crowd that surrounded James and his mother slowly began to realize the power of unity. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to protect each other, like a true family, formed from shared pain and a desire for justice. Each of them brought their own story, their own fears and hopes, and this common energy began to form a powerful current that could move mountains. But in that moment, James knew they couldn't just confront the police. Their fight was much deeper. It wasn't just a confrontation with the police, it was a war against a system that had oppressed their community for decades, perpetuating stereotypes and prejudices. In that chaos, they became one, which gave them the opportunity to express their thoughts and feelings. "We're not just protesting," James shouted, feeling the words escaping him. "We're saying no more to this racism, no more violence. We demand respect and equality." His voice echoed across the square, and people began to raise their hands in support, their voices merging into a single rhythm. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. People who had once felt isolated began to realize that they weren't alone. Those who were ready to fight for their rights were gathering around them. Meanwhile, the police, seeing their grip on the situation slipping, became even more aggressive. They formed a cordon, blocking the exit and squeezing the protesters. James felt the tension in the air growing, but instead of being scared, he felt determination growing within him. "We will not retreat," he said, looking at the faces of the people around him. "They cannot take away our dreams and hopes. We must be strong." James's words had an impact on the crowd. Anger and passion became the engine that drove people to continue the fight. But there were still those who hesitated, who feared the consequences, who were unwilling to risk their comfort for the sake of change. "If we retreat now," said one of the activists, a young man named Marcus, "we will betray those who fought before us. We will betray the memory of those who suffered because of racism." The crowd responded with a unified shout. It was a sign that they all understood that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for everyone who had ever suffered from prejudice and discrimination. They were united not only by pain, but also by hope for a better future. But on the outside, things were starting to get ugly. Protesters began to see police using unacceptable tactics. They were attacking defenseless people with tear gas and rubber bullets. James remembered how his friend at school, Ryan, had suffered police violence simply because he was black. The memory brought him clarity. His struggle was not an accident. It was part of a long story. "We're not just protesting the police," James said, raising his fist. "We're protesting an entire system that has marginalized us for centuries. We're protesting the racism that permeates every part of our lives." Flags and banners began to rise around him, with slogans reflecting their desire for equality and justice. People began to sing, raising their voices against oppression. This protest music was a reminder of the strength of the spirit, that they would never give up. But suddenly, a cracking sound came from the crowd. It was a sound that made James's heart stop. Someone in the square started throwing stones at the police, and it immediately caused a response. The police, seeing the threat, acted without hesitation. "This is not what we want," James shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the general noise. He knew that violence would only make things worse for them, and he did not want all their efforts to be in vain. "Stop," he shouted, raising his hands to stop the crowd. "We can't afford to be provoked. We have to be better." As if in response to his words, one of the police officers began throwing tear gas into the crowd. James saw people scattering in panic, but he couldn't let fear divide them again. "We are stronger," he shouted, stepping forward. "We are here to change the system." Some protesters began to gather around him. Their hearts were filled with anger, but also with determination. They began to form a line, forming a human barrier between the police and the rest of the protesters. "Together we are invincible," James shouted, and on their faces he saw how slowly but surely fear was replaced by determination. Each of them knew that if they did not fight for their rights, they would never see change. At that moment, James remembered how much fighting for justice meant to him. He thought about his father, who was an activist at a young age, and how he taught James to never give up and always fight for what is right. "We must preserve the peace," he said, turning to the crowd. "This is not our war against them. This is our war for equality." The crowd began to shout his words, and more people joined in. It was not just sounds, but a rhythm that filled the square with the energy of hope. But the police kept pushing, and soon more officers joined them. The tension was in the air, and James knew they had to act fast now. He and his supporters began moving toward the exit, still holding the barricade to protect those still in the square. "Don't be afraid," he shouted as they began to retreat. "We must remain united." And though they had no clear plan, they knew they had to tread carefully. On the edge of violence, they tried to maintain peace, but every step was a reminder of how fragile their situation was. James knew this wasn't just a protest, this was a war, and they couldn't lose. As the protesters slowly retreated, James noticed his mother, Laura, struggling with pain. She smiled at him, as if to let him know he was doing the right thing. Even though they were in a tough spot, he felt that love and support gave him strength. "We will reach the end," he said, looking firmly ahead. And in that moment, he realized that the fight against racism was not just for black people, but for all those who wanted justice. they stood together, united by a common goal, and that was what gave them strength. There was a fire in their eyes that would not go out. When they reached safety, James turned to look at his mother. She was with him, and that support gave him determination. Together, they were ready to continue the fight, knowing that there would be many obstacles on the path to justice. But in that moment, he felt like they were already part of something bigger. This wasn't just a fight for equality. It was a movement, and its purpose was clear. James knew that they wouldn't stop until they changed the world around them, until every person had the freedom and respect they deserved. This was only the first step in their long journey. James stood at the edge of the square, his heart beating in time with the rhythm of the crowd, which was now one, a stream of hope and determination. The shouts and protests and sounds of shaking anger continued around them, but at the same time, a spark of understanding was lighting up on many people's faces. They were not alone. The assembled protesters began to talk about the importance of continuing their struggle beyond this night. As they discussed their future plans, they realized that they needed to be smart and organized now. They decided to form a group that would work to protect the rights of Black people, organize meetings and actions, and work with lawyers to draw attention to the injustices they faced. "We can't stop here," James said, looking at the hopeful faces of the people. "This is just the beginning. We have to show that we are not afraid, that we cannot be broken." His words drew loud applause and cheers. The protesters began to come up with ideas, holding educational seminars, collecting information on cases of racial discrimination, engaging local media in the discussion. It soon became clear that they were creating something more than just a protest. But the fear of the authorities' reaction remained. The police, seeing that control of the situation was slipping, continued to raid poor areas, and James knew that they had to be on guard. However, this could not break their spirit. That evening, after the protests died down, James returned home to his mother, full of emotion. Laura was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face haggard but her eyes shining with pride. "You were magnificent, son," she said, hugging him. "I've never seen you so strong." "Thank you, Mom," James replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "I feel like we can change all this. It's not just words." "I believe in you," she said quietly, and then added, "But I worry about you." "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be careful. We'll be careful." James knew they had some tough work ahead. The next morning, they formed a group, with plans to not just protest, but also launch a platform for people to share their stories, experiences, and resources. They created a hotline for reporting police violence and bullying, and began collecting petition signatures to raise awareness of what was happening in their city. Over the next few weeks, protests became regular. People gathered in the park to discuss how to change the situation. They worked with local activists, wrote letters to the city administration, and tried to attract the attention of journalists. The protests began to appear in the news, and soon even people from other cities joined in. Among them were students, working people, old people and young people, all united for one purpose. They met at rallies, organized pickets and flash mobs. It was a powerful movement, and it began to attract attention. Meanwhile, James and Laura continued to delve deeper into their studies of racism and the history of oppression to better understand the issues they were facing. James began blogging about his experiences and his thoughts on the importance of discussing and addressing racial bias. Their initiative became more and more popular with each passing day. More and more people became aware of what was happening, and James felt that their struggle was beginning to bear fruit. They received support from local organizations, and this inspired them to continue. However, not everyone viewed their activism positively. Some police officers, furious that their actions were being criticized, began to threaten the protesters. One day, as James was walking home, he noticed that he was being followed. It reminded him of his first encounter with a racist police officer, and he felt fear trying to take hold of him again. But he knew he couldn't back down. He thought of his mother, of all those who had fought for their rights, and that their movement was important not only for them, but for future generations. It was his duty to continue this fight. With each protest, with each meeting, their movement became more visible, but their successes began to exacerbate conflicts. Police began to resort to violence, using rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse the crowds, but instead of breaking the spirit of the activists, this only fueled their anger. James knew they had to be smarter and more careful. They began organizing safer protests, educating people on how to avoid violence and how to stand up to aggression. Every time there was shouting, he reminded everyone that this wasn't just a physical fight, but a fight for people's hearts and minds. One night, as they were discussing their next steps, there was a knock at the door. It was Marcus, with a tear-stained face and a worried expression. "James, we're in trouble," he said, his voice shaking. "They're going to break us up next Sunday. They're going to clean up the mess." James felt fear creeping up on him, but he couldn't afford to panic. Instead, he gathered the group to discuss what to do. Their courage was even greater than their fear. "We can't let them win," he said, looking his friends in the eyes. "This isn't just about us. This is about the future, about our children." The crowd gathered around him, frozen in anticipation. "We must be prepared for any consequences," James continued, "but we cannot retreat. If they want to stop us, we must show that we are not afraid." The next few days were a real test. The group worked tirelessly, printing leaflets, organizing rallies and attracting more people. They collected signature sheets and demanded changes in the local police, including the creation of a committee to monitor their actions. On Sunday, as protesters gathered in the square, James felt his heart beat faster. They all knew this could be their last stand, but instead of fear, there was a fire of determination in their eyes. "We are here to make a change," he shouted, standing at a makeshift podium. "We are here to say no more to racism, violence and prejudice." The crowd responded with a powerful shout, and James knew they had reached the point of no return. They were ready to fight, ready to defend their community and their loved ones. This was more than just a protest, it was a movement demanding change. As they began their march, James felt a wave of support and unity. People from all walks of life came together to support them. It was the moment they had been waiting for. But soon, as they passed a police cordon, a conflict broke out. The police began to disperse the protesters using gas and batons. At that moment, James realized that their words and actions had become a threat to their power. He was struggling to get through the crowd when he saw one of the police officers attack a woman who was simply trying to make her point. "Stop!" he shouted, moving forward. "It won't be long." The policeman turned around, his face contorted with contempt. "Get your hands off me, Sheriff," he growled. "You're not in our county." But James couldn't just stand by. He moved closer, his heart beating in unison with the protesters, and he knew that every moment mattered. He decided to address the police. "We are not against you," he said, his voice confident. "We are against the system that makes you act this way. We are not the enemy." To his surprise, several police officers began to waver. James felt confidence returning, and the crowd united again. Their voices melded into a single chorus, demanding respect and rights. Gradually the police began to retreat, their actions becoming less aggressive. James knew this was a crucial moment. They had shown that their movement could not be stopped. And while they didn't know what would happen next, they knew that every step forward was an opportunity for change. James looked at his comrades, and in that moment, he realized that their fight was just beginning. Soon after, they held their first forum, which brought together local residents, activists, and even police officers. It was a new era, a new opportunity for dialogue. They discussed racism, bias, and, most importantly, ways to change. James became a key speaker at these meetings, sharing his thoughts, stories, and lessons they had learned from their protests. Each time he spoke, he felt his voice grow more powerful. He realized that not only his community, but many others were beginning to understand the importance of these conversations. Over time, their movement began to bear fruit. They had achieved the creation of a training program for police officers aimed at combating bias and improving interactions with the community. James felt that they were truly changing the system, and it was incredible. But the fight wasn't over. Every time James went out on the streets, he reminded himself that the road was full of obstacles. But now, instead of fear, he felt supported. Together with friends and supporters, they created a foundation for change. One day, as James stood in the square, he looked at the people who had come and realized that their struggle was not just their own story. It was a story they were writing together. A story of strength, unity, and hope for the future. James knew his journey was just beginning, but with that one thought, he could look to the future with confidence. Every day was an opportunity to make a difference, and he was ready for that fight. Thank you for joining us on this emotional and important journey. We are very interested to know your opinion about our story. How did it make you feel? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments, they are very important to us. We appreciate each of you and your stories. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories. Have a nice day.